Welcome everyone to Pathways to the Orchard. Tonight we're going to be discussing Parshat Vayakel. And in this Parsha, Moshe comes down with the second tablets. And Vayakel means he gathered together. Moshe gathered everyone together. And for the first time, he's going to reveal to the people the concept of making a Mishkan, a tabernacle. We had 2.5 parshas already, Truma, Tetzaveh, Tetzaveh, and half of Ki Tisa that had to do with the Mishkan. But those were all instructions from God to Moshe. Here, he's gathering everyone together in order to tell the people about building the Mishkan. And right in the beginning, though, the whole parsha is about the Mishkan, except the first few verses is we'll call it a warning that building the Mishkan does not override keeping Shabbat. One might think, building the Mishkan, what could be more important than building a dwelling place for God in this world? And of course, that is a pretty important thing. But the Torah is telling us very clearly, Shabbat is Shabbat. You work for 6 days, and the 7th day is Shabbat. And then it adds that you cannot transfer fire on Shabbat. So what we're going to do tonight, we're going to follow a theme in 3 different parts. In a sense, it's all one idea, but we're going to somewhat divide it into 3 ideas that flow into each other. And the theme that we're going to explore tonight is the connection between the Mishkan, the tabernacle, the creation of the world, the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, and the connection of Shabbat and fire. And we're going to try to see the connections between all these ideas, between creation, Shabbat, Mishkan, giving of the Torah. And we're going to start with the idea that we've discussed many times, and that is, according to the Arizal, the creation of the world was dependent on the concept called Tzimtzum, contraction. Before there was time, space, matter, world, anything, there was only the infinite essence of God, the infinite Ein Sof, the light of the infinite Ein Sof. And so the Arizal explains that in order for there to be, as it were, a place for finite reality, God had to contract his infinite being in order to make space for a finite reality. This is a well-known concept called Tzimtzum, contraction, and this was the prerequisite, because if there's only infinity, then philosophically, where do you make place for a finite reality? It's all part of the infinite. It's all part of God's oneness, and it still is. That's what we say in the Torah: Ein od milvado. There is none other than God, or Ein od. There's nothing else but God. But nonetheless, for there to be time and space and creation, God had to, as it were, carve out a space for what at least appears to be independent reality of creation. And that's called Tzimtzum. So we're going to see, though, that this concept is not just about the creation. The whole concept of the Mishkan is also dependent on Tzimtzum. How is that? There's a midrash that when God first told Moshe about making a holy place, where he said, Asuli mikdash v'shechanti b'tocham, make for me a holy place, and I will dwell among them. So the midrash says, Moshe said to God, the whole created universe cannot hold you. You're beyond this finite reality. How is this little tiny tabernacle going to hold your presence? And so the answer is through the idea of tzimtzum, that God is everywhere. Nothing can exist without the presence of God, the life force of God. But in the Mishkan, God, as it were, contracted himself in order to manifest himself in the tabernacle. And this, we're going to get to it in a couple of weeks. This is the secret of the small aleph of the word Vayikra. When Moshe had finished making the Mishkan, this is the end of the book of Shemot, and he finished making the Mishkan, he erected the Mishkan, and then it said Moshe was outside because the glory of God filled the Mishkan, and Moshe, like, there's no place for me to enter. It's like full of the glory of God. And that's how the book of Shemot, of Exodus, ends. And then the book of Vayikra, Leviticus, begins, Vayikra. God calls to Moshe and invite, and like, I'll make space for you. Come into the Mishkan. So the whole idea of an infinite God beyond, when we even contemplate the largeness of the created universe, it totally boggles the mind. It's beyond our real conception. Even 1 light year is like so vast a space. And here we're talking about tens of billions of galaxies, tens of billions of stars in each galaxy. Each galaxy is thousands of light years away from each other. It boggles the mind. And yet, in comparison, the created universe is finite. Only God is infinite. But here we have the secret of Tzimtzum, that God is contracting his infinite being in order to be perceived in the Mishkan. So here we have a deep connection between the forces of creation and the reality of the Mishkan. And then I mentioned before about the giving of the Torah, but I left out one other connection we're going to make, and that is to Gan Eden. We're going to see as I mentioned in the beginning, we're going to have 3 different insights that are going to develop these ideas. But here we're just concentrating on the idea of Tzimtzum. So the creation is dependent on Tzimtzum. The tabernacle is dependent on Tzimtzum. And Shabbat is also dependent on contraction. After a whole week of our running around, expanding ourselves, God creating the world, then comes Shabbat, and we have 39 major categories of work that we don't do on Shabbat, the same 39 categories of work that went into building the Mishkan. and we hold back. We contract our nature to be running around, to be expanding. So Shabbat also is dependent on this idea of tzimtzum, of contracting our deeds, also our speech. We're not supposed to be talking about mundane things on Shabbat. And it's also a contraction of our thought process. We're supposed to limit our thoughts to those ideas that are connected to Shabbat, and not to be thinking our business and everything we didn't get done during the week and everything we have to do next week. We're contracting our thought, speech, and action. And also, the whole reality of Gan Eden was dependent on one mitzvah. God said, don't eat from the Eitz Hadat Tov V'Ra. Don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so our whole mankind's ability to stay in the garden was dependent on limiting our actions, that we don't eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So here we see all of these ideas are connected to the idea of tzimtzum. So now let's develop this a bit. So here we have a lot of paradox, that when we think of creation, whether our the way we envision it is the Big Bang that starts from an infinitesimal dot, a spark of matter, and the universe is still expanding. So when we think of creation, we think of expansion. The universe is still expanding. And according to science, it is actually expanding quicker all the time, which is a great mystery. It's a great mystery. Let's say you throw a ball, like in the major leagues, they even measure how fast the fastball is. Somewhere about 100 miles an hour. Okay, but let's say you're not throwing it into the catcher's mitt. You're just throwing a ball. At a certain point, the laws of physics is it's going to slow down. It's not going to keep the same speed and the same arc. The laws of gravity will limit it. And here we see that the universe is expanding at increasing speeds, which flies in the face of our understanding of even basic physics. So we think of creation as expansion. But when we really think about it, if we go back to the concept of tzimtzum, in order for God to create, he had to hold back his aspect of being infinite. In other words, finite creation could not come into being if it was overwhelmed with the total presence and total infinity of God. So during the 6 days of creation, we have a dual dynamic here. And this is what's called ratzo v'shov, running and returning. But here we're starting from the return. God is holding back his infinite being in order that creation could come into being. And creation is very expansive. But what happens on Shabbat from God's point of view, as it were? It says that God finished his work of creation on the 6th day, and he rested from all of his work. And so in a sense, what is God resting from? He's resting from holding back his infinite presence. And this is what makes Shabbos so special, because God now allows his infinite light and being and presence to enter in to the time, the holy time of Shabbat. Now let's look at human activity. During the week, we're not holding back at all. We're out there doing whatever we're doing. Everyone's doing something different, but everyone will use the expression, everyone's running around. Everyone's trying to make whatever they want happen to happen. And then what happens on Shabbat from our point of view? Then we hold back from our creative pursuits, and we experience the contraction of our thoughts, speech, and action. So if you follow this is like a mirror image. God during the week during the creative process is holding back, and then Shabbat allows that infinite ambiance to be perceived. We do just the opposite. During the week, we are running, we are active and expanding, and on Shabbos, we hold back. But since it's like a mirror image, it fits together perfectly. So this is a very, very deep idea that God begins pre-creation is infinite. Creation is the aspect of finite, and Shabbat returns us to the idea of infinite. We have the same idea with Gan Eden, is that we were in Gan Eden, and then we had to go into exile from eating from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. But we're told that the metaphor is that on Shabbos, we return to the idea, the concept, the ambiance, the experience of the Garden of Eden. So here we have a lot of dual dynamics of running and returning, of infinite and finite, of expanding and contracting. And in a sense, especially with the creation, it's happening at the same time. We're talking about that first God had to contract his infinite being in order to be able to make the expansion of creation occur. But in a certain sense, they're happening at the same time. So it's the same thing with us. During the week, we really only get anything accomplished is when we limit ourselves to trying to accomplish that which we want to accomplish. In other words, we could wake up in the morning and theoretically, we could decide any one of a million things to do. A million things to do. We could be at a job for 40 years and wake up one morning and said, I've had it. That's it. I'm not going to work anymore. Call up the travel agent. You could travel all over the world. In other words, the ability to accomplish in this world happens to limiting oneself to the task or the purpose or the mission that we have set for ourselves. So it's also happening at the same time. We're expanding, accomplishing, doing, but at the same time, we can't do everything. We have to limit it. We have to contract what we're doing in order to accomplish anything. So we have the same idea with Har Sinai. In a certain way, it's talked about in Kabbalah and Chassidut that the Torah is the will of God. And that will of God is expressed in the letters of the Torah. And relative to infinity, the letters are finite. There's an Aleph, there's a Bet, there's a Gimel, there's a Daled. They form words, they form verses, they form passages, they form parshiot. But God is streaming his infinite will and light into finite letters. So here, what happened at Mount Sinai was a once in a history event where God allowed his presence to be manifest in the most real and way of being experienced than any time in history. We're told that the seven heavens opened up, all of the dimensions merged together. We were able to see what we usually can only hear, and hear what we can usually only see. All of the senses, synesthesia, merged together. And this was all happening because God wasn't holding back. He was allowing his presence to be felt. But at the same time, we're told that it was such a strong experience, our souls left our bodies. We really couldn't handle such a revelation. And that really explains why God has to be so hidden in the world, because infinity, by definition, if allowed to reveal itself, would overwhelm creation to the point that it would cease to exist. It would all return to the infinite oneness of God. So for there to be a so to speak, independent creation, God has to hold back. But at Mount Sinai, again, God did both simultaneously. He contracted his infinite will into the finite letters of the Torah, and at the same time allowed a once in history revelation as much as a human being could handle, could take. And so we see the same thing with Shabbat. When we contract our thought, speech, and action to what is fitting on Shabbat, and we observe the laws of Shabbat, and we observe the ruach, the spirit of Shabbat, so we are limiting tremendously what we can do. But at the same time, that allows us to tap into infinity. Again, it's a great paradox. And in fact, this is the secret of all the mitzvot. Shabbat is a particularly good example, but every mitzvah is very defined, very exact, very limited. The more we learn about Jewish law, any mitzvah, if you really get down to the details, could have hundreds of little details how to do it in the best way possible. So this limits doing a mitzvah in the correct way is very focused. And yet, through doing that mitzvah, we have a direct connection to the infinite light of God that's filling that mitzvah. So here, these things are very paradoxical, but in short, what we could say, this idea of running and returning, of expanding and contracting is two sides of the same coin, and they work together in a very, very paradoxical manner. Okay, so that was the first idea that I wanted to bring, is how this idea of contraction connects the Mishkan, connects creation, connects Shabbat, connects the giving of the Torah, and the Garden of Eden. So now we're going to go into a little bit more detail about each one of these. And we're going to start with the connection between the Garden of Eden and the Mishkan and the Tabernacle. And what I'm saying isn't all that could be said. Talking about contraction, we have a semi-limited amount of time to give over this class. So I'm picking out the main examples here. So first of all, we know in the Garden of Eden, there were two major trees. The focus of much of the story is the Eitz HaChaim, the tree of life, and Eitz HaDat Tov V'Ra, the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And so the tree of life is always connected to the Torah. The Torah in the book of Mishlei is called Eitz Chaim Hi L'Machazikim Ba. It's a tree of life for those who grab onto it, who grasp it. And we say this every time we return the Torah to the Ark after a public reading of the Torah. So if we look at the Mishkan, in the holiest place called the Kadosh Kadoshim, the Holy of Holies, was the Ark. And in the Ark were the two Luchot HaBrit, the two tablets of the law, and the original Torah that Moshe wrote before he left this world. And so here, like I say, in the synagogue, when we take the Torah out and we return it, we call it the Eitz Chaim. And in our synagogue, the Ark with the curtain and where we keep the Torahs is a replica of the Mishkan, of the Holy of Holies, and the Ark that was kept in it, and the Torah and the two tablets of the law that were in it. So here we see a direct connection between the Garden of Eden and the Mishkan. On top of the Ark in the Mishkan and later in the temple were the two kruvim, the two angelic figures. And we're told that there was a male and female figure, and they were naked. And so this represents Adam and Eve before the sin, before they ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil and were expelled from the garden. So in the Holy of Holies is the image of Adam and Eve before they sinned, the ideal human beings in the ideal situation called the Garden of Eden. And then outside of the Holy of Holies, we have the menorah and the showbread and the incense. And the showbread is also connected to the Garden of Eden, because we're told that when Adam and Eve had to leave the garden, the consequences of their actions, so sometimes we refer to them as curses, but really they were just the natural development of the consequences of what they had done. But for Adam, it said that the earth was cursed because of Adam, and that he would have to sweat in order to bring food from the earth. to get through the sticker bushes and the weeds, and to be able to farm and create agriculture, that he'd have to work very hard because the earth was cursed. And we're told that that lasted for 10 generations until Noah came. And Noah, according to tradition, created the plow and made it so much easier in order to work the earth. And that represented that the 10 generations of a curse of being expelled from the Garden of Eden was now over. Man would still have to sweat in order to bring his parnasa, his livelihood. So the bread in the Mishkan also represents the fixing of the original curse of what happened with Adam. And we know that in the Mishkan, there was a lot of gold. There was gold, silver, and copper. And the Torah explains exactly what was gold, silver, and copper, but the most prominent metal was gold. And what's interesting is that in the story of the Garden of Eden, it said that the 4 rivers flowed out of, there was a river, and it split into 4 branches, into 4 rivers. And it mentions that one of the rivers was the place where gold came from. And so the idea that there was so much gold in the Mishkan is very, very connected to this idea that gold was very connected with the Garden of Eden also. So these are a few ideas connecting the Garden of Eden with the Mishkan. Now let's make a connection between the Mishkan and creation. And we said before that the idea of tzimtzum is cardinal, fundamental for both creation and for the Mishkan. So again, I'm just going to mention a few of the things, but there are many, many commentaries that go into great detail how the Mishkan is the microcosm of the macrocosm, meaning the entire creation is symbolically appears in the Mishkan, in the different metals, in the different materials, in the dimensions, the sizes, the colors. Everything represents something from the upper worlds and from the creative process. So I'm only going to mention a few of them. And that is that the sanctuary, the inner sanctum of the Mishkan, meaning it's surrounded by the outer court, had boards, and over the boards there were curtains, and within the boards and the curtains, that's where the menorah was, the table of the showbread, the incense, and the ark within the Holy of Holies. Really only 4 major, we'll call it pieces of furniture, elements in the sanctuary. And so the boards, they were 10 amma high. An amma is from the elbow to the tip of the fingers. But it's around a foot and a half. And so there were 10 amma high. So the 10 represent the 10 sfirot. Once the walls are up, then it was covered by curtains and pelts of animals. And there were 2 curtains and 2 pelts, 4 all in all. And this represents the 4 Kabbalistic worlds. Asiyah, the world of emanation, the world of Bria, the world of creation, the world of Yetzirah, the world of formation, and the world of Asiyah, the world of action. And so the sanctuary represents the 10 sfirot through which God created the world, and the 4 worlds that encompass the spiritual worlds as well as the physical worlds. The curtains were, especially the lower curtain, was 28 amas by 4. So this is very, very significant, because these numbers, 28 and 4, they were 28 long and 4 wide. So this represents the unity of time and space. What's the connection here? In the book of Kohelet, Ecclesiastes, King Solomon gives over what are called the 28 times. There's a time for every purpose under heaven. And a time to be born, a time to die, a time to laugh, and a time to cry. Time for war, a time for peace. And there are 14 pairs, 28 times altogether. And this represents the cycle of the lunar calendar. Even though the lunar calendar is 29.25 days approximately, 28 is the word koach, is power. And here is the power of time, is symbolically these 28 time periods, a time for this and a time for the opposite. 4 represents space. You have the 4 cardinal directions, you have the 4 worlds, you have the 4 elements, you have the 4 seasons. So the seasons is actually more time, but it manifests in space, how trees will go through the development of the year in the time ways, but we see it in the buds, the fruit, the leaves, and then in the fall, they fall to the ground and then they're bare. So we see it in space. So here's the unity of time and space. But 4 is a very, very cardinal number when it comes to space. And so the curtain was 28 by 4. And the Ramban says, when it says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So the Ramban asks, well, what was first created? And he says, time and space. Because before time and space, there's only the infinity of God. Time and space, going back to our first insight, this is the beginning of finite creation. And so these measurements of 28 and 4 it is representing the unity of time and space in creation. And then we have in the menorah, and I believe we learned this already a couple of weeks ago, but I'll go through it very, very quickly, the 7-branched menorah. So obviously this is connected to the 7 days of creation. And the way that the menorah is constructed is a middle shaft and 3 on each side. So the middle shaft represents Shabbat, and the 3 and 3, the 6, represent the 6 days of creation. And then we learned that that God created the world through the Hebrew letters and through speech. And so when we looked at the menorah, so we see that there were 22 cups, there were 9 flowers, flower-like metal sculptures, and 11 knobs. And we learned that the 22 represent the 22 letters. The 9 represents the 9 vowels. And the 11 represents the 11 sphira when you count both Keter and Dat. So the menorah represents this idea of God creating the world through speech and through the Hebrew letters. So here, again, I'm just picking out a few of these ideas where we see this deep connection between creation and the Mishkan. And then we saw a deep connection between the Mishkan and the Garden of Eden. And now we'll also make a connection with the giving of the Torah. As we mentioned already, the giving of the Torah entailed a contraction in one sense, and the revelation on another sense, both happening at the same time. But here, we're going to connect it more to the Mishkan. So when we received the Torah on Mount Sinai, so we received the 2 luchot, the 2 tablets of the law. Well, these 2 tablets of the law were guarded and housed in the ark, in the Holy of Holies. So here already we see a very deep connection. And the Ramban makes a very important statement, and he said that the entire idea of the Mishkan was to take the experience of Sinai and, in a sense, recreate it in the physical the Mishkan and in the experience of being in the Mishkan. And so here we see many of the elements that we talked about before, that the menorah is connected obviously with creation. But when we read Parshat Yitro and we read about the physical phenomenon that was happening at Mount Sinai, so we're told that the mountain was full of fire and light. And so the menorah represents the light that God revealed at the giving of the Torah. Also, we mentioned already that at Mount Sinai, the 7 heavens opened up. And this is connected to the 7 branches of the menorah. The sages tell us in Pirkei Avot, im ein kemach, ein Torah. If there's no flour, there's no Torah. And at the same time, im ein Torah, ein kemach. If there's no Torah, there's no bread, there's no blessing. So here in the Mishkan, we have the table of the showbread to show that there's a deep connection between receiving the Torah, and if someone is starving, they're not going to be able to learn Torah. And if someone has no money, it'd be hard to even do some of the basic mitzvot. So im ein kemach, ein Torah. There's no flour, there's no Torah. And if there's no Torah, there's no flour, there's no blessing that will come. And so that's connected to the showbread in the Mishkan. And then we have the idea that it says about when the Torah was given, that the whole mountain was full of ashan, smoke. And we're told in Kabbalah and Chassidut that this word ashan represents more than a physical smoke that was happening. The three letters of ashan represent, the ayin is olam, which means world. The shin of olam represents shana, which means year. And the nun of ashan represents nefesh, which is soul. But we're told that the ayin of ashan, olam, means space, and the shin, the shana, means time. So we had the dimensions, the three dimensions of space, the dimension of time, and the dimension of soul and consciousness. And here, science is now catching up with this concept of ashan, because now we know of the unity between the dimensions of time and space. And right now in physics, the cutting edge of physics is the role of consciousness in not only affecting reality, but creating reality. And so this ashan, where do we see it in the Mishkan? This is the smoke from the ketoret, from the incense. Every day, incense was lit in the Mishkan, in the temple, and created a smoke. The smoke went up in like a pillar. And on Yom Kippur, the holiest day, so the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, went into the Holy of Holies with incense until it filled the whole Holy of Holies with this smoke. So here again, we see a deep connection between the giving of the Torah and the Mishkan. Okay, now we want to connect it to Shabbat. How this parsha begins. Remember, the whole parsha of Vayakel is about the Mishkan, but the beginning is telling us the importance of keeping Shabbat, even when constructing the Mishkan. The Mishkan does not override the laws of Shabbat. And there it says the idea that you cannot kindle or transfer light on Shabbat. Now, what's interesting, of the 39 major categories of work, and each one of those categories of work have hundreds of subcategories. But in the Torah itself, only two acts are mentioned. One is not going what's called outside of the Tachum of Shabbat, outside of the boundary of Shabbat. And here, the idea of lighting a fire. And so, as we mentioned before, the Torah is telling us, by including this little passage about Shabbat before the Mishkan, the importance of keeping Shabbat, but also the 39 major categories of work that we don't do on Shabbat is learned from the juxtaposition of Shabbat to the Mishkan, because this is not the only place where Shabbat is mentioned directly connected in juxtaposition with Mishkan. And so the idea is telling us, and the work that we can't do on Shabbat is called malacha. That's the word for the creative work, but it's the same word that's used for the creative works of the Mishkan. And so here we see this deep connection between keeping Shabbat and making the Mishkan. But as we said before, we see that there are many elements of creation in the Mishkan. And here we want to connect Shabbat and fire to creation as well. And so where do we see this? So first of all, I just want to mention that according to all the commentaries, when it says you should not light or transfer fire in Shabbat, of course it means it literally. Literally, we don't light a fire in Shabbat. On holidays, we're allowed to transfer light, but not make a new light. But on Shabbat, we can't light a new light or transfer light. But it's brought down that it's telling us much more than that. It's that fire represents anger, represents judgment, represents ego. And so we're told that in order to enjoy Shabbat, in order to get into the flow of Shabbat, we have to get beyond anger and jealousy and simple desires and judgment. And that's why the court system did not operate on Shabbat. There was no judgments on Shabbat. So that's just an expansion of what it means, do not light a fire on Shabbat. And so here we want to see that both Shabbat and fire are instrumental in the creation. When we go back to the first word of the Torah, Bereshit, so we see when we exchange the letters, we permute the letters. So the 6 letters of Bereshit, one of the permutations is Brit Eish, a covenant of fire. And this has a tremendous connection to modern physics and cosmology, because we're told that right after the Big Bang, the universe was, the words of, I believe, Brian Greene, a great physicist, a Jewish physicist, says that he called it exquisitely hot. In other words, the original bang was so hot, even atoms couldn't form. It was like a plasma. Nothing could form. It was so hot. And this is the Brit Eish, a covenant of fire. That's the origins of the physical universe. And so on Shabbat, the whole idea is that we're not creating. We're resting from the different acts of creation. And since fire is so instrumental in the foundation of the physical universe, we specifically don't light a fire. And that's, the Torah is the only thing that it mentions. Everything else we know from the oral tradition. Now, another permutation of Bereshit is Yirah Shabbat, the awe of Shabbat, or Ya'er Shabbat, the light of Shabbat. And here again is the idea of the menorah in the Mishkan, the light of Shabbat. And so here we have fire and Shabbat right in the word Bereshit. The Mishkan, we go back to the original verse, V'asuli mikdash v'shachanti b'tocham, make for me a holy place and I will dwell in their midst. So the word for dwell is the root of the word Shekhinah, v'shachanti, I will dwell. So God's indwelling is referred to as the Shekhinah. And in Kabbalistic terms, the Shekhinah represents the more feminine aspect or energy of God. Now, obviously, God does not have gender, and God is not a male or a female, but we do talk about energies, that there is male energy and female energy. And so God's surrounding light is a more male energy, but God's presence in this world is a more feminine aspect. And that's why the name of God used exclusively in creation 32 times is Elohim. And Elohim is the name associated with Gevurah. And Gevurah is on the left side of the Sefirot, which is the feminine side. And so here in creation is, in a sense, the revelation of God's presence, his more feminine aspect. And the Mishkan also, because we're told that in the Mishkan, in the first temple, was the presence of the Shekhinah. We're told already by the second temple, that presence wasn't as strongly felt. In fact, it was somewhat missing. That had to do with the actions of the people. But so the Mishkan itself is a very, very feminine energy, is a receptive. We would go to the Mishkan, we go to the temple in order to receive the presence of God, to be influenced, to feel what's called the shefa, the flow, the divine flow, but it's a feminine divine flow. And so here, creation and the Mishkan is a very feminine idea. Again, the idea of Mishkan is connected to the word Shekhinah. So here, if you look at the first word of the Torah, because here we're trying to connect the creation to the Mishkan as well. The first letter of Bereshit and the last letter spelled Bat, daughter. And so this tells us that the entire creation, as it were, is the receiver of God's giving. The creation is God's giving, and the world is the recipient. We are the recipient. We are the bat. We are the daughter. And the middle letters spell out Ashrei. Happy is the daughter. Happy is or fulfilled is the daughter. And this Ashrei, so we say this prayer, Ashrei, which is the 145th Psalm with two introductory verses that are Ashrei, which means to be joyous, to be happy with God's creation. And on Shabbos, so we already said that the first word of the Torah already is talking about Shabbat, and that's what we say in Lecha Dodi. Sof ma'aseh b'machshava techila. The end of deed is the first in thought. So already the thought of Shabbat is encoded in the first word of the Torah. And that's why in the Amidah, the main prayer of every day, but Shabbat as well, and in Kiddush, at night, we say, Zecher l'maaseh bereshit. Shabbat is a remembrance of the creation of the world. Zecher l'maaseh bereshit. And so every Shabbat takes us back to creation. And now to connect it with the giving of the Torah. Hopefully everyone's following that we're tying together all these different ideas and showing that there's a synergy between creation, the Mishkan, the giving of the Torah, Gan Eden, Shabbat, fire, all of these things are melded together. And so when we say Zecher L'Maaseh Bereshit, but when we get to the giving of the Torah, so the expression in the Talmud is L'Kulei Alma B'Shabbat Nitna Torah L'Yisrael. Everyone agrees that the Torah was given on Shabbat. And so Shabbat has the element of creation, has the element of fire. Now here we're told we can't light a fire on Shabbat, and we can't transfer a fire. But how do we initiate the Shabbat? How do we greet the Shabbat? By lighting candles. In other words, there is fire there. Everyone knows the ambiance of the Shabbat candles in the house on Friday night. And when we do Havdalah, when we end Shabbat, we also have a candle, because the end of Shabbat represents the beginning of the next week, is the beginning of creation. And so in a sense, the first thing created was fire. We see Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. And shamayim is shin, which is fire, eish, and mayim. So the first thing is created is fire. Brit eish, the permutation of the word Bereshit. Okay, so there's lots of ideas here, and it's so good to see the interchange of how each one of these ideas that we could look at one-dimensionally. The giving of the Torah is that incident. What happened in Garden of Eden is a separate incident. The creation is its event. And the building of the Mishkan happened in its historical time. But here we're seeing a flow between all the different energies and all the different elements in the Mishkan that relate to all of these. And since this Torah portion is mostly about the Mishkan, what we try to accomplish tonight is to show how the Mishkan truly is a microcosm of creation, of the Garden of Eden, of the giving of the Torah, and the great importance in all of this of Shabbat. And the fire represents the fire of creation, the fire of, there's positive fire and negative fire. So we have to put down anger and jealousy and judgment and ego, all these things are represented by fire. But we begin Shabbat with fire. This is the passion to be close to God, the desire to imbue the special ambiance of Shabbat, to feel our extra soul that we get on Shabbat. So we should all be blessed to understand the interchange between all of these ideas. And may we see a day that is all Shabbos. May we see the rebuilding of the third temple. And may we see true peace in our time.